I wonder what your thoughts are on our current situation in Canada with assisted suicide soon to be legal and recommended option for doctors for the mentally unwell. As a Canadian, this is a very startling and depressing turn of events. Yeah. Well, it's no joke, and I definitely find it depressing. I can't say that I find it startling, and that is because of a topic that I think it's fair to say, banged on about throughout the lifespan of this show, and that is the nature of the human being, right? What is a human being? And somebody said on Twitter about this: the slippery slope remains undefeated, which was to say that we were told, well, euthanasia is just in this small context of people who we know are going to die, so they're just going to, die without all the pain they would have. And we knew that, the premise that, Augustine says, quoting Aristotle, a small error in the beginning makes a big error in the end. And especially in a system where, the state is finding it more and more difficult to provide healthcare for people, you're going to get a situation in which eventually death is offered as a remedy for poverty. And that is basically, or weakness or illness, and that is basically what we're starting to see coming out of Canada. And I think this is intimately connected to the abortion issue, and that both issues exist, on either side of the boundaries of the human person, right? In time, right? The abortion question is, when does a person, begin to have the value of a person? That is to be a person in the eyes of the law, and to be human in the eyes of God, a unique human being. And when does a person, when is it right for a person to kind of cease to be a person, right? And this is, the reason that we're having this conversation is because we all have instilled in us by Christianity. It's not that other ways of thinking don't have this idea in them, but Christianity is the mode of thought that instilled this in the Western mind. Along with Judaism, right? It instilled in us the idea that being whatever a human being is, right? It is imprinted with the image of God. And this is kind of it's not a full definition in some ways, because then we have to ask, well, what's the image of God like, right? But it is a tautology in some ways. If only if something is a person, it is imprinted with the image of God, right? Or rather, if something is a person, it is imprinted with the image of God. Put it that way, at least. The simple and less kind of controversial version of this is, if something is a person, it's imprinted with the image of God. And if it's imprinted with the image of God, then certain things are true, right? You may not deprive it without just cause of life, right? And this is why the abortion question, right, hinges on, and should always hinge on, what is a person? What is a human being, right? Is a fetus a human being? And I have stated my answer to that question, which is yes, from conception. And then, you reason as if there were two human lives at stake in any abortion question, right? And you have those conversations around the edge cases in that way, right? But even more fundamentally than that, right? The first question you're asking has to be, what is a person? Because all the other questions that we start to ask are kind of peripheral to that, right? Like, who, has the right to make decisions about bodily autonomy, right? That's a distraction of a question, because we're not talking about bodily autonomy of one individual. We're talking about the existence of another individual and debating whether that individual is a person, right? So this is why, right, the abortion thing hinges on that. The MAID thing, this is a kind of chilling euphemism for medically assisted dying, for euthanasia, which is itself in some ways kind of a euphemism for at this point, offering people to off themselves in exchange for not having to pay rent, right? Or not having to suffer through the pains of poverty rather than trying to alleviate them, right? Becomes, right, what's in front of you? Is this person a person, right? And to what extent is their life, right, inherently worthwhile? Because that's another thing we say about personhood, is that the goodness of the life is not what makes it worth living, in the sense of the pleasurability of the life. And that's not to say that people don't suffer terrible things on earth that we should have great compassion for and try to alleviate. It's just to say that the reason why we live is not because it's always pleasurable. I was just reading Seneca on this topic, actually, and tweeting him out a little bit. we don't live because it's pleasurable. We live because life in itself, human life in itself, is a good. And so these two questions, both of which have been kind of troubled or distracted from or forgotten in these two debates, have created two forms of horror, right? This kind of expanding remit of death, right? That you can kill a baby later and later in the womb after it's born, right? All these horrific arguments that we've had on the show. And now that you can, the doctors can suggest that somebody kill himself for all sorts of reasons, right? That could be more this bigger and bigger pool that people would fall into in their despair. It's chilling, and it all hinges on the same situation, which would be a good high-level political question for some candidate or party to take up, right? I know that this is a little bit abstract, but it cashes out in all these important ways into like basic political platforms, right? That all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, right? These things are instinctively true to Americans still, and a lot of our politics would be, I think, better served by somebody really taking that head on and making that the core of all his decisions, right? We are people. What is a human person? Well, from conception until until natural death, right? That this person is a person, and therefore his life is worth something. His life is immutably worth something and can't just be wished away for convenience sake, right? Can't be measured by any quantitative measurement like wealth or status or money or even wellness, right? These sorts of things, which it's not as if these resolve all the difficult moral questions. It's not like I don't see that it's, that people are sometimes tempted to suicide, right? And that's a terrible tragedy. Or that sometimes you have in very rare cases, a pregnancy that threatens the life of the mother. Like, it's not that I don't see those exist. It's just that I think you will gain moral clarity on all of them by beginning from the immutable and irreducible value of a person in the eyes of God. And from there, you can start to have all these other political questions. I hope, and we'll pray for Canada, Nick, that things turn around, although, nothing is impossible with God. So we should keep praying. We should keep working and talking, although it does look bleak over there. And thank you for the question.